Thank you everybody for joining us as we are gearing up for looking down at new topics in our program lineup. I want to encourage everybody to join us on the 19th of November. We have Dr. Andrew Bacevich, The Trump Years. Dr. Bacevich has written a fabulous piece in Foreign Affairs about American power, and I will send that out shortly with the announcement. We are also convening our esteemed panel in early December, on the 3rd of December, to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. And we are honored to have Dr. Andrew Wilder speaking to us. Dr. Wilder is the Deputy Director of the Institute of Peace. He's also a pivotal member for the Afghan Working Group. So we will be pivoting back to state actor issues. We hope everybody can join us, and that you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving season and Halloween season between now and then. So with that, we're going to get started. Al?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining. I wanted to share my perspective. I've been fortunate to be in a unique position where I spent about 30 years in the state of California as a law enforcement officer. And working for municipalities, I had the advantage of starting as a patrolman and ultimately retiring as a chief of police. During that time, in conjunction with my military career, or my civilian career as a police officer, I joined the military reserves, specifically Navy. And within the Navy, I became an intelligence specialist. So the reason I mention this is I was working naval intelligence, and I was an active police officer before and after the events of 9/11 occurred. And I want to share with you my history, my observations, and in the differences between communication before and after 9/11. Because of my law enforcement background, I was assigned to Navy Special Warfare as an intelligence officer, which is in essence the SEAL teams. And I was part of a group that created an intel unit to support the SEAL teams specifically. This was prior to 9/11. And we had operations that we did throughout the world, but after 9/11, those focused primarily in the Middle East, going after Osama bin Laden. As a law enforcement officer, prior to this, we really didn't have a lot of joint counterterrorism task forces. Our interaction as a city or a municipal police department with the Federal Bureau of Investigation basically dealt with bank robberies, on occasion maybe if they were looking for a fugitive. So when we talk about communication within the law enforcement community, it's very personality driven, and it really is deals a lot with the culture within law enforcement, but we'll get to that just a little later. You know, when I think about it, I was reminded of the movie The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and the ugly of all this is the bottom line: terrorism information getting down to the average police officer on the street really isn't there. Now, this is a generalization. There are always exceptions. Here in the state of Nevada, you've got a intelligence center up in Washoe County, run by the Washoe County Sheriff's Department, that does a real good job of getting information down to the Washoe County Sheriff's, Sparks PD, Reno PD. Down south in Clark County, you have the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center that does a real good job of funneling information down to the troops there in Las Vegas. And then in Northern California, you have the Nevada Threat Analysis Center that, again, does a good job getting the information out to the rest of the state. The challenge comes in how it filters down to the beat cop. And a lot of this is personality driven, a lot of it is politically driven, in that if the police chief of that city is telling people that there isn't a problem, and then a problem pops up, the odds are it's not going to filter down. That's just been my experience. and the reality of things. Even as an intel guy with the military after 9/11, where I would be privy to secret, top secret, and above information, and the concerns that we had with, let's say, for example, a specific group migrating from the Middle East or Africa coming into the United States. And a lot of this stuff was held at a very high information level, where most of your cops, your police officers, don't have a security clearance. Most of them don't have any official training on how to deal, what to look for, and how to deal with that information. So your average street cop just really doesn't get a lot of information, generally speaking. When you look at the state level, most states have Department of Homeland Security authorized and sponsored threat centers, intel centers. And they do a pretty good job in collecting information from the federal government, whether it comes from three-lettered agencies. We can only, as the state's threat center, you can only disseminate information at the law enforcement only level or official use only level. Whenever there is secret information, we have to go to the sender to have them bust it down to a level that the officers can access. The FBI, DHS does a real good job with that when there is those kind of information out there that they need to know. They do a good job of eliminating the part that makes it classified to be able to share it with the patrol officer. Before the patrol officer gets it, though, it goes through other channels. It'll come in through either the leader, the chief, or his or her designee, or if, like in Nevada, where we have fusion liaison officers that have received specific training, it'll go to them. And then it's up to them to disseminate it or pass it out to the troops. And again, it goes back to the watch commander, whoever's briefing those troops on what information goes out. So that's kind of why street cops don't get a lot of that info. It's better at the state level, where again, you have the state fusion centers that pass it out to their fusion liaison officers or their points of contact within the respective law enforcement agencies throughout the state. I know in the state of Nevada, we had, when I was with the Threat Analysis Center, I think we had about 1,500 individuals that were trained to receive information that the Threat Center would put out so they could disseminate. There's other distribution lines that go straight to certain law enforcement agencies. The feds do a much better job at sharing, but still a lot of the problem or the challenge comes with the culture of our community. There's the old saying, power is, information is power. I have a secret. I have, that's very powerful. I choose who I share the information with. You have people, in my experience, that have been driven by a personal agenda versus what's best for the community. And so that interferes. Those are obstacles to good, solid communication down to the troops. And the thing that challenges it, I remember years ago, put this in an unclassified arena. Years ago, there was concern about the Somalis coming into the United States. The terrorist cell of the Somalis that were coming in. And so as they established themselves in certain cities, there were efforts to monitor their radicalization. Subsequently, we got information that there was a individual in San Diego, California, who was radicalized in San Diego, who eventually made their way back to Somalia and then overseas. So that kind of exposed a new area or line of communication for foreign fighters to go in from the United States to go overseas. So when you're dealing with things at that level, most of that information is classified at top secret. That isn't something that can get passed down to the troops. And it gets real frustrating with cops if you were to go out and say, hey, if you run across any Somalis that you think are terrorists, let us know, because it begs just 100 questions. Then you have the other issue of there will be certain organizations that now feel that we're targeting this group specifically because of whatever reasons. Big challenge for good quality information to get down to the street cops. The other downside is, in my experience, most street cops are there for the big time. They're not there to go to the barking dog calls. They're not there to go to, well, your neighbor, you think your neighbor stole your hose. They want the robberies, the rapes, those kinds of things. So when you give them information, it's got to get their attention real quick. And a lot of them have niches. So you get some cops that are computer nerds that will kind of migrate over to doing things with the computer, crime analysis. They like charts and bar graphs and those kind of things. You've got your other patrol officers that are just out there to hook up the felons. They don't care about charts and graphs. Just tell me where the bad guy is and I'll go get him, or I'll go find him. Then on top of all of that, you have the challenge of the political climate within that community. And so when you have a police chief who is an at-will employee and they're under pressure to keep things safe, and if they get word that there may be a group coming in here, their bosses may not be that supportive of doing specific efforts to target that. Again, this is a generalization. There are always exceptions. Even when I was a police chief and I had knowledge of certain criminal type activities coming through town, I could only share it at a certain level with my boss, but if it didn't meet the political parameters that they wanted us to stay in, it was kept in the dark. A more recent kind of experience would be like here with the state of Nevada. I would write a threat assessment for the state every year. And one of the individuals that I interviewed prior to preparing the threat assessment to see what their concerns were, one of their concerns was opioids and how it was killing people. And I said, yeah, I got it. And did some research, presented some information that at that time, methamphetamine was a larger cause of death in the state, wasn't opioids. But that didn't, the individual I was interviewing, they wanted opioids, so that's all they heard. So you have those facts and those realities that come into play when you look at trying to send accurate and quality information down to the street cop level. It has improved a little, but again, it's personality driven most of the time. And I believe that's mainly because of the culture that we have within law enforcement.
Al,
My time in the, yes, ma'am.
I'm going to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I want, we pull the thread on something you just said. Could you bring this down to, you know, sort of the specific examples that we were dealing with in the protests this summer in Nevada, and how you believe that people were able to get information or not information? How did it work specifically around the protests here in Nevada and other places in the country?
Well, as these protest events would come up, we would gather information from different sources, social media, and not informants. People would submit suspicious activity reports, tips and leads. Then we would pass that on to the local authority, whether it be the sheriff in Carson City, the sheriff in Douglas County, a county sheriff somewhere else in the state, and we would disseminate that. Depending on the county and the sheriff would depend on their response. What we found is that as the groups would put information, for example, on social media, that would help guide law enforcement efforts to better prepare for events. for better ideas of how many people are going to be there. Then, depending on the chatter and who's talking, you could see there'd be times where people who have had a history in violent behaviors, in criminal activity, where they would be posting things encouraging certain other behaviors. It was kind of in line with several reports from FBI and Department of Homeland Security that talked about emerging tactics, capabilities, that the more violent side criminals that were using lawful protests as an avenue to commit violence have certain techniques that they use. Those were being documented throughout the United States, passed around through the law enforcement circles. Usually, not so much in Nevada, other places, it'd start off peaceful, but then someone from the back crowd would throw a rock or a brick, then a small group would emerge and they would commit crimes and acts of violence. I'm sorry, I digress. Just keep it to Nevada here. With the Nevada, because of people calling us, giving us information and social media, we were able to get a good feeling and a good assessment on who the troublemakers would be, what type of trouble they might make, which would allow, that information would allow the leadership, whether it be the sheriffs, to formulate their plan on how best to deal with it. Here in Nevada, they had pretty good success establishing relationships with certain points of contact within a group that was holding an event or a protest to make it very peaceful and safe for them to lawfully protest and express their First Amendment rights. There have been other instances, whether here in Nevada or in other states, where law enforcement has been told to stand down and allow the criminal activity to happen for whatever reasons. A lot of those times, the officers have told me that, hey, we were told if it's property damage, let it burn. We were only to intervene if life was threatened. Those are decisions obviously made in the political arena. And as police chiefs or sheriff, well, not so much with the sheriffs or elected officials, but most police chiefs are at-will employees. And so if their boss tells them, hey, don't write parking tickets over there, don't write speeding tickets, don't arrest arsonists over there or vandals, then that's the decision that leader has to make. But the intel community collects what it does, it analyzes it, the trends, the patterns to the best of their ability, and they give that to the local law enforcement, who then does whatever with it. Sometimes they ignore it, sometimes they don't. A lot of times, sometimes they'll come back to us as intel professionals and ask us for a little more information or to look into other things, but it is up to the local law enforcement to create a plan. I had some experience with this. There used to be a group, the Westboro Baptist Church. Their website was godhatesfags.com, and they would protest certain events, and they would videotape them, and they would try to bait law enforcement into doing and saying something really stupid, which would ultimately result in a lawsuit. I had an occasion back when I was a division commander where they actually came to my city. And I was able to make contact with the Reverend Phelps was the leader at the time, who since passed. His daughter was kind of the head organizer. She at the time was very receptive to communication with the police department. We gave them an escort from the time they set off the plane. We gave them a very specific place where they could protest. Same with the counter protesters. They worked with us, which ultimately resulted with no criminality, no arrests, nobody in danger. Doesn't always happen like that. There are people that, for whatever reasons, are just there to cause problems. we see that in Seattle, Portland. We see it throughout the United States, where for whatever reasons, local law enforcement is not responding to their full capacity and making arrests, and then the system doesn't do their end, where instead of charging them and putting them through the system, they let them go, so they go back out. There's no penalty, there's no consequence to that bad behavior. They just go back out for more problems. But here in Nevada, we've, my experience spending the 3 years at the Threat Center that I did, we did, the overall law enforcement, I thought, did pretty well. There were some isolated instances where riders were allowed to do their damage, but that's a decision the city leadership makes on what do they want to deal with. And I have no input on those. You know, from a law enforcement perspective, very frustrating, because a lot of us that signed on to be officers truly believe in keeping the community and the citizenry safe. And it goes against everything in our soul to sit back and watch people loot, burn, steal, and not do nothing. You know, I had retired from law enforcement back in 2005. I've been in a dozen riots and all sorts of things, and it's a different world now. I don't know that it would be very challenging for me to just stand there and do nothing with the oath that I've taken. Anyway, did that answer your question?
Yes, it does, Al. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your insight on the ground. I'm going to move to a few questions, but first I'd like to call on Bill and Liz and Mike Jensen to give us a little perspective. We're trying to help people understand, how do we bridge between the kind of information that you're producing at the high academic level, detailed studies and analysis of trends and patterns that are going on, terrorism, domestic extremism, hate crimes, however you want to group it. And you're hearing from Al that it's a challenge still to get that information on the ground in ways that are workable. So give us your perspective back on things that you think we can do to help bridge that gap between rigorous academic studies and what folks like Al and his group have to do to respond to protests in the middle of the summer of 2020.
Sure, Maureen, that's easy. No problem.
Yeah, there you go. I give you the softballs.
Yeah. So I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time. I'll offer a few thoughts. One, I think we should be realistic about the role of academic research. And it's not always the case that the role of academic research is to inform the patrol officer or the beat cops. Sometimes the work that we do can be distilled down into very useful information at a more tactical level. But oftentimes it's actually for the decision makers who are making resource allocation decisions about whether to invest in training or equipment, or whether to hire the next IT or cybersecurity specialist or the next linguist, right? You know, so there's different consumers of the information. And there's also a process, right? So the basic research creates understanding. Applied research helps end users solve discrete problems. Both basic and applied research can be built into training curricula and eventually turned into norms across a community, an organization like a law enforcement community. And that takes time, right? And so not every research project is going to generate the instant tactical win on the ground, but it might fundamentally change the way we do law enforcement in over 3 or 4 or 10 years. The PIRES team, the team that's on with us today, Mike Jensen, Liz, and Sheehan, they've just created the first data set in the country on perpetrators of hate and bias crime. That's a shocking statement.
That is a shocking statement.
The Uniform Crime Report has data on the hate crimes, but not on the perpetrators of hate crimes. And so they're using this to update sort of the most commonly used typology of hate crime offenders. They're using it to really improve knowledge, which will eventually make its way into practice. But that might take a while, right? And I think we have to be realistic. A few other very quick thoughts. Relationships like this. So I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to the brief, that the idea that we're going to create a one-page research brief that's going to make it into a roll call training, and that's the only way we have to influence law enforcement. We can also create relationships, institutional relationships that lead to dialogue and the kind of nuanced conversations you actually have to operationalize the work. That's a more realistic, right, I think, expectation. And so START has formed relationships with you. START has formed relationships with the organization that runs the SLAT program, where our research is informing SLAT training now, the state and local anti-terrorism training that the Bureau of Justice Assistance funds for law enforcement across the country. We have relationships, obviously, at the federal level. Those relationships hopefully can drive better research transition. We try to generate data sets that are objective, transparent, and that are updated over time. Al mentioned the instance of the Somali American or the Somali individual in California, San Diego area. It's not, we shouldn't expect that an analyst in Connecticut or Tennessee is going to have visibility based on their relationships to what's happening in San Diego. But we at START have the luxury of being able to generate data sets that are nationwide or in some instances global. And we could provide those unclassified data sets to get around the classification issues so that a fusion center analyst on the East Coast can look at data from the West Coast and make connections between either individuals or organizations that have operated from coast to coast. And so that, it sounds very simple and basic, but just generating large data sets, making them available, gives coast to coast and historical record to our analysts and our officers who couldn't know those things based on, right, no matter how good they are, that there's no way to know that if you're sitting in Tennessee. And so those are just some ways that we've tried to overcome this, but we would be fools to think that we can solve, easily sort of solve these issues. There's a reason why this is hard.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Indeed. Bill, I appreciate your perspective. And I think one of the things that, and it comes to some questions that I'm seeing in the chat right now, one of the things that helps with this relationship building is the depoliticizing of the information. So you're dedicated to the academic analysis. You don't have a political bent one way or another. You're providing, you produce that information. So you're depoliticizing the information. But then we have the challenge of depoliticizing the movement of that information to the folks who need to get it. So Kevin, I'm gonna come back to you to some questions about, and this pulls the thread, Al, on some of the things you said about at-will employees, okay? Kevin, I'll start with you. Can you talk a little bit about that notion that maybe some information that gets passed down that could be acted upon doesn't get acted upon, whereas some other information does? And how do we, if you had a magic wand, and were, I don't know, you had a, that's right, you have your magic marker. How would you depoliticize the movement of this, sometimes very highly charged information so that it's more effective and people can act on the ground, and that we as citizens have confidence that you're acting in ways that are protecting us and not in a political response?
Well, that's not exactly a simple question, Maureen, but let me try to approach this. And of course, my perspective is from that of a rural law enforcement agency. with an elected sheriff. So there's not the same level of politicization, if you will, vis-a-vis a mayor or another elected official wanting to skew or sway something for political reasons. It has been my experience, and about a decade experience on the street, that actionable intelligence is acted on. Things typically were not pushed aside or mitigated or ignored. If there was something that was actionable, somebody was paying attention to it, regardless of political position. It was something that needed to be dealt with and needed to be dealt with. In some cases, if it wasn't an immediate threat, it was more an activity that was brewing. Sometimes that was kicked up to an initial report, and then it was kicked to a grand jury for further action. So sometimes we would see that sort of thing. The intel that came from NTAC, which was very valuable, generally was, it wasn't something that, okay, you need to go find these people and arrest them. It typically wasn't that nature. That would be something that would come through direct law enforcement channels, in the form of warrant service, that sort of thing. I think in a lot of cases there was very, very good information, particularly in our region, about the sovereign citizens movements, which present a pretty serious threat to law enforcement and community, but especially law enforcement. And I think
Kevin, could you give for our participants, could you please, you or Mike, please define what we mean by the sovereign citizens movement?
So, I think I can toss it out quickly. Sovereign citizens basically don't recognize the federal government. They refer to themselves as constitutionalists or free persons. Some of them are just kind of wackadoodles and somewhat extremist. Unfortunately, there are a number of them, and there are a lot of incidents of violence and murder upon police officers and public officials. The extreme fringes of that movement are very dangerous, and we do have a fairly significant footprint in Nevada of that ilk. And the Threat Assessment Center did a really good job of providing training to field level officers on awareness, detection, and best practices on interactions with them. So from a street cop's perspective, that was one of the most valuable training and intelligence, if you will, actionable intelligence that we received, on a regular basis from NTAC.
So I do want to, because Bill, you mentioned that you're involved in the training, Bill, and the START crew. Where do sovereign citizens fall in your kind of analysis? Where does that movement fall in your kind of analysis?
Should I let the Pirates team answer that? Mike or Liz or Sheehan, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. So it is a movement. It's hard. A lot of people want to know, okay, how many individuals are in this group or something, right? And it's a really diffuse movement. There are people who are picking up this propaganda online, or, typically it had been more distributed, through contacts, but now it's online. So they're not really groups. We typically call them far right because they're sort of associated with the anti-government extremism that's in that end. But, again, that's an imperfect label, certainly. And so, yeah, that is something that we talk a lot about to law enforcement, we did a survey before I was at START a while ago, asking law enforcement officers, what do you see as the biggest threats from extremists in your home counties and areas and jurisdictions? And sovereign citizens was certainly one of the highest ones. So, we track that when they do cross the line into illegal and especially violent behavior. As Kevin was saying, a lot of them, might be sort of consuming and distributing and creating extremist content, making weird license plates, and Kevin looks like he knows what I'm talking about, and IDs for themselves. So some of that is harmless. Some of it can be very enormously problematic. but it really comes to the core usually when there's a confrontation. So often, if they get pulled over or something, and that's a moment when maybe they hadn't been planning a terrorist attack per se, but if they believe that they should not, be subject to the jurisdiction of the local sheriff or something, then that's when they're going to have a violent conflict. So it's something that we track in terms of violence and to some extent illegal activity, but it's very diffuse and it's really hard to get numbers on and that kind of thing. So
Excellent.
yeah.
Thanks, Liz. I'm gonna keep pulling the thread on things that are going on the ground. So I'm gonna throw out a question, and it's going to be a combination of any number of the panelists who can answer that. Clearly, one of the biggest issues that I think, and Al, you touched on this briefly, but I'd like to go into more detail. One of the big issues that we had obviously this summer, and it's still ongoing, is the issue of peaceful protests, Black Lives Matter, peaceful protests, and the intersection of that with extremist groups on both sides. So certainly we had the issues with the far left extremist Antifa. Al, I think you said, sort of capturing and taking advantage of a peaceful protest and doing something that caused disruption. We have seen the joining of Proud Boys and other folks on the right coming into some of the protests. From an on-the-ground perspective, how do you guys deal with the notion that you have to protect the First Amendment right of people peacefully protesting, and yet you have to respond to a potential usurping of that protest, and you have to communicate the difference between the two to the public. So Al, I'm going to bounce that to you first, and then I'll come back to whoever else wants to respond.
Yes, ma'am. When you mentioned that, the first thing that kind of struck my mind was the differences in recent events, protest events in Douglas County and Carson City, or maybe Reno would be a more starker contrast. For example, you may recall several months ago there was some controversy with the Douglas County Sheriff's letter to a library employee reference Black Lives Matter. And so Black Lives Matter took to the internet, took social media, came down here to Douglas County to protest. And the communication that went out, I live in Douglas County, I live in Minden. The communication that came out to us with the residents gave us a clear expectation that our sheriff was not going to allow criminal activity, that you were welcome to freely protest lawfully and legally, but that any illegal activity would be dealt with. Working that event, monitoring it, there was 1,000, 12 or 1,300 citizenry. Some sovereigns in there, some normal citizens like myself, that were there in support of law and order. And the element that was looking to cause problems left early. I can't go into detail. We don't devolve our techniques and how we know these things. But there was an element there that actually left early because they knew that, let me rephrase, they felt that the crowd would vigilante themselves and take action before the sheriff even had a chance to get there. The sheriff was well prepared. His troops were well prepared. They were almost everywhere you looked. And so this element left early, took off. They go other places where they feel they can get away with things. And then you look at like what happened in Reno, where there was vandalism and to say the least. Those people feel more comfortable operating in those type of environments. In Carson City, on one of the events, the sheriff there had, again, made it clear that you can do this lawfully, But if you're going to do criminal activity, we're going to stop you. And to my knowledge and my recollection, we never had any events or any instances of vandalism from the times where they were holding lawful and legal protests. There were things that got close, where they went down on the Capitol and they got close to some of the monuments, and there was concern that they may try to vandalize them, but the sheriff's department was all over that. So from what I've seen, it certainly depends on the attitude of the head of the law enforcement agency. And certainly to Kevin's comment, you have county sheriffs that are elected, and even some of the sovereigns we've run into will listen to the sheriff because they're an elected official, where they don't like the government, and that's their big rub. So in some of the more rural areas of Nevada, they go, the only person I listen to is the sheriff. But in communication to the community, and certainly to the troops, that comes from the top of that law enforcement agency. And both the sheriff of Douglas and Carson, I thought, did outstanding jobs in the way they communicated expectations, and the very small element that wanted to cause problems, were very confident that the sheriffs were telling the truth. And then that reflected in their behaviors, especially where, it was interesting to watch on cameras in Carson City, where you had an event organizer with a megaphone stepping into traffic, yelling, waving their hands. And it was interesting to watch the dynamic where at first they'd have people around them, probably the true believers in why they were there. But when they saw this person kind of going overboard or doing things that they really didn't need to do, you could literally see them on the camera kind of get about 2 or 3 feet away from them. And then if they had an encounter with somebody where they were getting in their face and yelling and screaming, people around them, a lot of them just literally walked away because they weren't here for that. Now, fortunately,
Thanks.
I think that speaks to our people in this area. They didn't provoke it, clearly.
Thank you. I appreciate your response, Al. And I'm gonna go on this third rail. Okay, so I'm gonna and inspired for all the NSFers who are listening, inspired by, I think, a phenomenal book that I just finished reading, which was Kathleen Belew's book, Bring the War Home, where she talks about the genesis moving up to the Oklahoma City bombing. And it's very insightful. So I'm gonna touch a third rail, and I want you to answer, anybody to answer as best you can. And Mike Matthews, this includes you, and Charles. So both from the federal side and the academic side, and also from the on-the-ground law enforcement. We do know that there have been cases, and I would say it's not the dominant, it's the minority, but there have been cases where there have been a collusion or sympathy, I would say, among law enforcement officials, military officials who are part of extremist groups. So when we're looking at how we're responding on the ground, how do we build confidence among us as citizens that the law enforcement is genuine, law enforcement, any action that we're taking is genuinely egalitarian, respectful of peaceful protest, responding to extremists on either side, when there is the possibility of sympathies, empathies with extremist groups on either side among the people who are responding. How do we deal with that situation? Mike Matthews, I'm going to bounce it to you because DHS has been on the hot seat for this issue. Not
I don't know what you're talking about.
Not to say that your sympathies are elsewhere, but to say that DHS is having to be drawn into complex situations recently.
I think this is I think this is kind of twofold. So one, we want a law enforcement community that is diverse and representative of the citizenry and the people. And when you get a diverse and widespread pool of candidates and applicants for law enforcement, you're going to have people that have these leanings and these thoughts and subsequent actions, unfortunately, no matter what happens. If you want diversity in a group, you've got to pull diversity, and you're going to pull people in. I think the answer to that is a more intense screening process. And I think we're starting to see that across the board with social media investigation now. We're seeing that on the corporate side where people are being turned down from jobs or being fired because they did something on their off time on Facebook or TikTok or whatever. And I think the future of law enforcement backgrounds and screenings is going to include a lot of social media, looking at not just their posts, but what groups do they subscribe to? What groups are they following? What groups are people looking at and listening to? What IP addresses has that location access? So if they have a ghost Facebook profile or something similar, you're going to see a more intense social media and digital screening of applicants, I think. And I think that's part of the answer to pulling that. I think the second answer is, and maybe this is a very naive approach, but I think a big answer is training, and it's not just cultural training and about understanding the different cultures, understanding the different problems that each culture subset in America is facing, but it's also a more intense use of force training and a more intense type of thing. So when law enforcement actually has to use their hands or has to use their non-verbal communications or non-verbal persuasion methods, they have a whole suite of options to choose from. And unfortunately, I think in today's law enforcement use of force standards, we don't have time to really develop that type of skill set and maintain that type of skill set. And knowing that, and kicking that option to Kevin as a follow-on, but unfortunately, we just don't have that time. As law enforcement officers, they don't have that time, and nor do communities have that type of resource to really pull that. But that's one of the answers, I think, is to really, one, understand your entire community, understand why they view things the way they are. I think that the more intense digital screening is an answer to screen them out before they get there. And one of the things that we ask when we do security assessments in my side of the house is we ask about continual background investigations. So as Al indicated, he has a security clearance. With my security clearance and those of us who had security clearances, there's a continual background investigation every 5 years or every couple years, depending on your clearance level, that requires a screening, and they go through the whole gamut again. Law enforcement officers, that doesn't happen. So you get somebody who's coming in right out of college or 21 years old, and they're missing that they're good to go. They have a clean background because they don't really have a background. And then 10 years later, they've developed different communities and different resources and different viewpoints, and we're not continuing to screen people. And perhaps that's another option, is to continue every couple of years, do another background investigation on your officers, and that will screen out people we've missed in the beginning. But I really think a big answer to this comes down to training, not only cultural training, but it really has to do with law enforcement use of force training, so we can give the officers more tools to use rather than brute strength and force, unfortunately.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Charles, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree that training, especially ethics training in law enforcement, I conducted a study 2 years ago that really showed police academies have less than 10% of police academies across the US actually have ethics training beyond in service, meaning at their academy level, their post level. Mm-hmm. So it, and I look at it, it's unfortunate that the ethics that we're teaching law enforcement is applied ethics, not the meta ethics. Are we having them think critically about, and I agree again with what Mr. Matthews had said, is that, we need to have this understanding of, are we teaching law enforcement incrementally on use of force or other tools and techniques. But I think also we have been remiss at either, both the federal government level as well as state, that our society is not being, lack of a better term, preached to, of, you know, we see lack of respect to authority. So what tools, techniques, or suite of tools do law enforcement, can they reach into a bag and utilize in order to protect not just themselves, but life if they have to? It's unfortunate that our society has fallen back onto this, that law enforcement, if they use any of those tools and techniques that they have, even if they're lawful, even if the, you know, that state has sanctioned those, it's unfortunate that the law enforcement community is villainized for those tools and techniques that are lawful for them.
Excellent.
That's all I'll add.
Thanks, Charles. I'm tap dancing on the third rails today, so I'm going to jump to another one, which is the concept of call them what you want. Armed non-law enforcement individuals, militia members, folks who are declaring themselves as defenders of the peace, but they're not authorized to do that. So I'm going to jump to Kevin first. How do you deal with that on the ground when you're law enforcement and you've got people out who may even actually be better armed than you are, who are not elected or appointed or trained or gone through the academy or any of those things? How do you deal with that movement, that inculcation of non-law enforcement people trying to do your job?
Yeah, condition orange is about usually the first step, and from your threat assessment level, and condition red is when weapons are deployed. Yeah, dealing with individuals, essentially to a degree, vigilantism is a very delicate and dangerous environment, and I can speak for the majority of people that I work for in that regard. There is a great deal of uncertainty and distrust when dealing with individuals like that. We try to get them to stand down as much as possible. It is I think it's, from my experience, again, a narrow lane here. You know, with the protests in Douglas County, we saw a lot of people armed, you know, exercising their Second Amendment rights along with the First Amendment rights. That raised the anxiety level of every law enforcement officer that was there. Even though a lot of those people were shouting pro-law enforcement, waving the banner of pro-law enforcement, it still made you really uncomfortable because you don't know what that person's mental state is, their abilities, their capabilities, and that. Conversely, there were some people there that were obviously extremely well trained, very well disciplined, very well organized. It was a disconcerting environment. We try to explain to people that, hey, we're here to do our job. We're here to keep the peace. And I feel the Douglas County situation was very peaceful. There were a lot of yelling and a lot of obnoxious behavior. There were suggestions that there were violence. We had a lot of cameras and a lot of people not in uniform watching. Didn't see it happen. Did see some people that were intoxicated trip over their own feet. But for the most part, while that was a very uncomfortable situation, we didn't see it escalate out. So beyond that, I can't really speak much more than that, and I will kick it to my colleagues for probably a more broader view of that circumstance.
Well, that's very helpful, Kevin. Thank you. And I want to close by saying, you know, NSF is committed to the civil discourse. This is a tough topic. It's a tough topic for all of us. It's a tough topic to take on, as Bill acknowledged, moving in-depth academic studies down to folks on the ground. And for people who are observing the situation, it's hard. You know, you're on the outside, you're trying to learn about trends and patterns, and then you're seeing what's happening on the ground, and there seems to be a disconnect. It's a tough topic to look at how law enforcement is responding in ways that may seem extreme on one end and then not as extreme on another side. Our communities depend on us being informed. And so I am very grateful for all of you for sharing your perspectives. So with that, I would like just to close with the sort of just a 30-second summary of where you think we're going in the future. And I'm going to start with Al, our speaker, and then I'm going to move to the other panelists.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't see a bright future in the near term with the overall, with the lack of willingness to engage unlawful behavior, with the lack of prosecuting, holding people accountable. That's been the key. Nowhere do I ever hear the accountability. If you just do what the officer tells you to do, you're not going to get hurt. The other issue that Dr. Russo and Matt had talked about, I think it's more with the screening initially, in the mentality of people. You have a lot of people infiltrating the military and police specifically to learn the tactics to take back to their groups. And the challenges that I had with my police union in trying to affect positive change, whether it was random drug tests for the cops, whether it was random background investigations for my guys working in the evidence room, they fought that tooth and nail. So there's a lot of things there, but initially, yeah, it's tough when people don't feel their police department is protecting them, and society, the government, the DA's not protecting them. It leaves little choice than to make sure you do what you got to do to protect yourself. I'm so thankful I live in Douglas County. I know the sheriff's got my back and my family's back. And I'm fortunate. I would not live in Seattle, Portland, and some of these other places that are just gone to Hades. I would not subject my family to that. More importantly, like Dr. Russo mentioned, you got officers, you got cops who did their jobs who have been incarcerated because of political pressures, public pressures, no due process. Man, that as a society, these are not good things. So someone bring a ray of sunshine in, please. I don't want to just leave it on this depressed note. But you asked, so you got it.
Thanks. I'm going to hop around here a little bit. Mike, you're always a ray of sunshine. Matthews. Off mute.
Yeah, see, I didn't think you were thinking about me when you said little ray of sunshine. I think you're blowing sunshine off your head. I think the country is eager for stabilization, and I think the country is eager for calmer times. And I think that I think they're going to clamor for that. Unfortunately, I think we're not over the crest yet. As Al indicated, I think the short term is going to be kind of rough seas for a while. I think the next couple of months are going to be very dynamic, and I think they're going to be very chaotic. And I think it's important for us to keep our eyes on the horizon rather than the near terms. And so, being a sailor, I'll give a naval analogy. When you're driving a ship, you don't focus on each wave that comes at your ship. You focus on the horizon, and that's where you're supposed to be going, and that's where you go. When your ship goes up and down on the waves, it doesn't really matter because you're maintained where you want to go, and you keep going there. When you focus on the waves, all of a sudden you're 10 degrees off course, and 10 degrees over 10 miles can lead to a very, very big difference to where you wanted to be. So I think we need to be focused on where we want to go as a nation and as an intelligence community, as a national security community. We need to be focused on actionable information, actionable results. We need to be focused on depoliticizing information and indicating that these tactics cost the county or the city or citizens this much money, and not even talk about the political spectrum or the why of what they're doing. We take out the why and we remove that political narrative. We talk about here's what's happened, here's what it cost people, and here's what should have been done about it based off of legal standards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in that instance, I think we can start moving forward and getting back to that more even keel as a nation that we saw, that we're used to seeing, rather than the past 12 months or
Excellent.
10 years, whatever.
Thanks, Mike. Mike Jensen, you've been quiet. Give me your 30 seconds on how we make the world a better place.
Okay. Well, so let me say about the horizon here over the next couple of months. I think it certainly makes sense to have concerns over further destabilization and concerns of violence, but I think we need to temper that with an understanding that it is still fringe groups that are most likely to be involved in those acts, and that the average person first inclination is not to behave violently when they want to express a political opinion. It's to engage further in the democratic process. So, since June, we've seen something like 15,000 public demonstrations in this country, and 97% of them have had no crimes committed whatsoever. Right? It's just further evidence that the average person is not prepared to or willing to engage in acts of violence because of their political ambitions or goals. So I think when we're speaking about these problems, especially when we're speaking to the public about the coming weeks and months, we need to ground concerns with data and evidence, because we certainly don't want to dissuade people from participating in the democratic process because of these concerns. From going back to the topic of law enforcement and academic interactions, one thing that I'll say about that is that it needs to be a two-way line of communication. We do our best to put out all the information that we have, all the findings that we have, and we try to make it as actionable and useful for law enforcement. But too often, we don't have a line of communication to hear directly from law enforcement what their needs are in terms of data and resources. So, we're often left to go on our assumptions about what types of information would be most useful to them. It just may not be accurate. So opening up further lines of direct communication between academia and law enforcement could certainly help with that problem. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Charles, do you have a perspective from inside of or outside of the U.S. intelligence community now?
I think, with the cadre of intelligence professionals, each day they come in knowing that they are trying to go through the volumes of information and really discern what's the threat, what's the emerging threat, and how are we going to face it. Of course, intelligence analysts are not the decision makers. They have input, really to the decision makers. They can, and without politicizing it, that's where I hold on hope that even as, once a practitioner, but then now as an academic for the last decade of teaching those, next generation practitioners, that one, and I'll go back to Matt. I love it because I'm a former Navy sailor myself. And so, having that, what is the direction that we need to go, and plotting that heading and continuing on that heading of, you just need to, regardless of extraneous, what's going on politically, what's going on civilly, knowing that you have bias and assumptions, but in analytics, we want to strip those away. We want to give just the pure facts, and holding that, truth to power of the information that you have. That's what I hold on hope of teaching the next generation, and also keeping in contact with colleagues at the agency and at the Bureau. These are still worries, but everybody still says, what, it doesn't matter who's in charge. I know what I have to do each day. I know what, is the emerging threat. I know what is the current threat. So those intelligence requirements and everything else is still holding true and holding fast. And that's what they work towards. So that's where I'm putting my stock in, and knowing they're trying to keep me safe. Same thing with the agents that work day to day as well. It's unfortunate. Yes, we have some bad apples out there, but is it that they started off that way? I would say never. No, that's not what they do. They're letting these bias, these assumptions come in and shape, how they are going to do their job. So, I think having this civil discourse, this talk, I think a lot of us are like-minded, but that's why we teach. A lot of us are practitioners and practitioner scholars that, we want to promulgate, yes, we can always reform ourselves. We can always be learning and evolving.
Excellent. Thank you. Bill, I'm going to give you the last word. We have just 30 seconds. I would like you to just give your personal thoughts with both an intelligence background and an academic background, and say, what's the top thing that we can do to make these communications work better and to be able to address these third rail issues that have degraded, I think, citizens' confidence in what's happening around them. So another softball to end our program.
So I think the center of gravity is reputation, institutional reputation. So if citizens don't trust the integrity of institutions, they'll go outside of institutions for their sources of authority and information. And so I think it's beholden upon people who sit within institutions to preserve the integrity of those institutions at all costs. And that means when you have a bad apple, you hold that person accountable. You have to hold, so in addition to training and screening, there's accountability after the fact. And that over time is essential. Sort of transparency, so that when you are communicating something that might be against somebody's personal political beliefs, they know it's not because you're a partisan. They trust you because you're always there with an objective kind of answer. And so I think protecting the integrity of your institution, both through accountability and transparency, and sort of in the case of professional institutions, nonpartisanship, is essential. And God help us if we vilify all of our public servants and public institutions who will serve. So I think we also have to, as those people within institutions, make sure we're not making it easy to vilify, for our institutions to be vilified, and that means holding ourselves accountable.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill. Sheehan, Liz, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate your perspectives, and to all of the panelists and to Al, our discussant. I really appreciate your perspectives. This is a hard topic. We will definitely come back to this in a while. To the NSFers, thank you for joining us. I hope you are with us on November 19th for our next program on the role of American power in the world. And in the interim, please, everybody, go to vote. If you haven't gone to the polls, go to the polls. Do not mail your mail-in ballot if you have it, because as we know, we've heard, the Postal Service isn't functioning. Drop it off at a box. Doesn't matter who you're voting for, please just go out and vote. This is an important time for all of us as citizens to do our job. So with that, thank you all to the NSF panel, and I look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Please, everybody, stay safe. Take care.